for the existentialist, truth is a way of being. It's not a collection of descriptions. So it's more embodied, you know, from the Piagetian point of view. And so truth is reflected in what you act. So Nietzsche would say, for example, it doesn't matter what you say. It matters what you do. And if I want to figure out what you believe, I don't ask you. I watch how you act. And I assume that your true beliefs are those that are directing your actions. And so truth is discovered in action. And that's a very different claim, you know, and it's not the claim of a passive observer. It's the claim of someone who's actively interacting with the world. And of course, we're always acting interactively with the world. And not only that, if we don't act interactively with the world, we cease to exist. So we have to do that merely to maintain ourselves. And so the existential claim would be, given that's in our essential nature, there are ways that you can act that are they're improper. And technically, it's like, for example, let's say you want A, and then you act in a bunch of ways that makes it absolutely impossible that you will get A. It's like an existentialist would say, well, there's something wrong with that schema. Like it's not necessarily immoral, because that would only be if you were willfully blind to it, but they would certainly say, well, it's got this self-contradictory element that makes it wrong. So insofar, it's like this, insofar as you're acting towards an aim. You want something. And then insofar as you want something, the fact that you want it constitutes the framework within which you evaluate the utility and truth of your actions, right? So it's like you come up with a theory of truth just because you're doing something, and the theory is A, that what you want is acceptable to want, and you know, that can be true or not, but it doesn't matter, you just assume that, and B, that those things that will get you to that end are appropriate. You can't get out of that if you're doing something. You're making a claim about the structure of the world and what constitutes appropriate action as soon as you make any action. You can't get out of that. One of the things that tends to set the atheists back on their heels is the observation that the religious people make that if there's no final meaning to anything, then there's no meaning to anything. And so that immediately elicits a kind of nihilism. It's like, if nothing means anything, why do anything? And it's a reasonable argument, because doing things requires effort. And you can say to yourself, well, why should I do X or Y, especially if X is difficult, if who the hell's going to know in 1,000 years, or who the hell's going to know in 100 years, or why does it matter anyways? And then the atheists will tie themselves up in knots trying to address that issue. But it's still pathological. It's like an a priori statement. So I could say, well, let's say you're nihilistic. You know, you have a lot of doubt about life's meaning and purpose, and it's like it's eating at you. It's a disease of the soul. And you come to me and you tell me 30 logical reasons why what you say has to be true. And I would say, those are excellent logical reasons, and you're making a very powerful argument. But it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. The fact that you're nihilistic means that you're infected with a pathology. And whether or not you can justify it rationally is completely irrelevant. All it means is that your rational mind is capable of spinning off a sequence of logical tricks. And the ultimate truth is, it's undermining your ability to live. And so it's wrong. Why is it wrong? I don't care why it's wrong. It's not relevant why it's wrong. What's relevant is you can't live like that. And that's an existential claim. Because the existentialists are interested in a different kind of truth. They would say that a truth you cannot live is not true. Because their definition of truth is different. It's predicated on action. And then the totalitarianism claim is the same thing. So let's say that you're an ardent right-winger, or you're an ardent socialist, or you're an ardent feminist, or an environmentalist, or who cares what the ism is. You've abstracted out a bunch of axioms, you develop a coherent representation of the world, and it's pathological. It doesn't matter what the content is. It's pathological because it's not you. It's not you. If it was you, then a million other people wouldn't believe it. So the existentialist would say, if a million other people believe it, it's definitely false. And they're not talking about scientific claims. That's a whole different order of discussion and description. They're merely making the point that you're an individual thing. And if you've been unable to particularize your experience, and you've replaced that with adherence to some sort of arbitrary and universal call to action or representation, you're pathological. It's a form of mental illness. Someone's nihilistic, they come and talk to you, they say, well, my life there's no meaning in my life. And I say, well, how do you feel about that? And they say, well, I'm really feeling bad. And then you say, well, that's a meaning. Feeling bad, being anxious, hurting, those are meanings. They're just not very good meanings. And so then you might also ask yourself, if your philosophy throws you in the direction of overwhelming negative emotion, anxiety, and pain, and that's a meaning, A, you might note, you're not going to argue yourself out of that. You know, which shows that there's a meaning basis. You can't just all of a sudden decide you're not hurting, you're not anxious. You don't have control over that. The meaning of your pain is completely impenetrable to your rational mind. So even if you're nihilistic, you have to admit to the meaning of negative emotion. Well, then what do? You just deny the existence of anything positive? Well, why is that reasonable? Maybe it's just that, well, you could be unlucky, and maybe you're not well. You know, and maybe you have reasons to be suffering that have nothing to do with the way you're construing the world. Because people do get unlucky. But there's always the possibility that the reason that things are so terrible for you is that you're inhabiting a pathological perspective. And that's an existential point of view.